Rain ran off Helena Webber's bonnet brim and down the side of her neck as she stepped from one slick stone to the next on Bond Street. The crate of ledgers wedged against her ribs so tightly that each breath came shallow. Her left glove had split across the palm before sunrise. The seam of the right had gone yesterday. Cold water slid through both and settled in the raw places where ink and lye had burned her skin through the night. Ahead, a Rathbourne carriage rolled toward the assembly rooms with bright lamps and polished wheels, carrying Lady Rathbourne and her daughters under wool blankets and foxed capes. Helena had watched it depart from the mews while she stood in the yard with the crate at her feet, and Lady Rathbourne had leaned from the window only once to say, "Walk, you are useful, not presentable." Then the carriage had gone. Men unloading baskets from market carts turned their heads now as she passed, then looked away with the quick, practised blankness reserved for servants and debtors. Her hem, mended twice with thread pulled from an old shift, drank from every gutter she tried to avoid. Her boots had cracked at the soles in January. By March they let in rain at every step. The leather slapped softly against her heels. She could feel the skin there rubbed open again. The morning had not yet lifted into proper light. London sat grey and metallic under low clouds, and the streets smelled of damp coal, horse sweat, wet wool, and the faint sweetness of crushed peel near a fruit stall not yet opened. Helena's stomach tightened and loosened in waves that had no rhythm. She had eaten half a heel of yesterday's bread at midnight while she rinsed account books in cold water to save Lady Rathbourne the fee for a copying clerk. She had stood at a scrub table until her shoulders burned, lifting each blotched page, pressing each with linen, then setting the ledgers near the kitchen range so they would dry straight and not curl at the corners. No one had thanked her. Mrs. Davies, the cook, had looked once toward the door and slid the bread to her under a folded cloth as if passing contraband. Helena had eaten in 4 bites because footsteps sounded in the passage. She had gone back to work with wet hands and an empty bowl. At dawn she had carried the repaired books downstairs herself, since the footman had been ordered to attend Lady Rathbourne's trunks and daughters, and not waste strength on clerical nonsense. By the time she reached Piccadilly, her fingers had stiffened around the crate handles so completely that she had to force them open one by one to shift the weight. The skin beneath her cuffs felt hot where old yellow bruises met newer ones, pressure marks from crates, broom handles, and one sharp grip at her wrist when she had spoken over Lady Rathbourne's figures in front of a mill owner last week. She kept her cuffs buttoned high in every room. It was not modesty. It was arithmetic. Exposed marks invited questions. Questions required answers. Answers cost meals. She crossed in front of a jeweller's window and caught her reflection in dark glass for a single step. Pale face, dark hair dragged into a severe knot, eyes too large from fatigue, mouth set flat from cold. Plain, they said, and repeated it often enough that it became a convenience for everyone in the house. Plain girls could be sent by service doors. Plain girls could stand while others sat. Plain girls could be spoken over, corrected, dismissed, and recalled with a hand gesture as if ringing a bell. Yet the candlelight in public rooms found her eyes and the line of her cheek whether anyone wished it or not. And when men looked twice, Lady Rathbourne's smile tightened by 1 degree, and the next day Helena's supper vanished. She was 22 and moved through the city as if she occupied borrowed ground. Once, in her father's lifetime, she had ridden this same route in a covered coach with account samples in her lap, listening to him test her French numbers and her German verbs until she could shift between both without pausing. He had been meticulous in ledgers and gentle in correction. Figures had to balance, he said, because people lived inside them. A widow's coal, a sailor's rent, a porter's medicine. He had taught her to carry columns in her head and to hear fraud in the shape of a sentence. Then he had died inside a single week of fever, leaving papers that should have protected her and debts that should not have existed. Her mother had married again with frightened speed. Her mother had died 2 winters later. Lady Rathbourne had inherited management and called it duty while selling Helena's books by the lot to a dealer who did not ask questions. The atlas went first, then the language grammars, then her father's brass ruler with the small nick near the edge where Helena had dropped it at 10 years old, and cried for an hour. Lady Rathbourne had moved Helena from her own bedchamber to a narrow attic under broken slate, and said the arrangement was temporary. 3 years had passed. The key to the old room hung at Lady Rathbourne's waist, beside a vinaigrette, and never left it. A hansom splashed past, spattering her skirt to the knee. She did not stop. She shifted the crate higher and kept walking, because she had arrived late once before and stood through an entire dinner without food, while Lady Rathbourne explained to guests that idleness was a moral failing common in girls who had never learned their station. Helena had learned station in measurable units: 1 cup of tea for translating letters before breakfast, no tea for correcting an error in public, 1 blanket in the attic if she finished mending by candle end, none if she asked for new thread, 1 day without shouting if she made herself useful enough to vanish. Charity functions were the cruelest because they required her mind and denied her person. She stood behind Lady Rathbourne at subscription tables and rendered polite German speeches into polished English while donors nodded at Lady Rathbourne's benevolence. She translated shipping terms, tariff disputes, and condolences from foreign guests whose names Lady Rathbourne never remembered. If she spoke too well, she was reprimanded for presumption. If she hesitated, she was called ungrateful. Public rooms made witnesses of everyone and defenders of no one. The assembly rooms came into view through the rain, columns darkened by wet, lamps smoking under iron brackets, the broad steps already marked with carriage mud, and the narrow prints of thin slippers. Footmen in Rathbourne liveries stood under the portico with stiff shoulders and dry coats. One of them, Thomas, glanced at her, and then at the crate, gilt flickering and gone. He reached as she climbed, but Lady Rathbourne's voice carried from within, before his hand touched the wood, "Leave it! She can manage what she was given." The words came through the open door with the rustle of silk and a drift of rosewater, light as if they had not weight enough to bruise. Helena's forearms shook on the final step. She set the crate down only when she reached the vestibule tiles and felt the relief as pain, sharp and delayed, up through both elbows. Around her, women in satin shook rain from capes and laughed behind gloved fingers. Men stamped water from polished boots and passed silver snuff boxes hand to hand. Nobody asked why one young woman stood dripping at the threshold with Clark's ink still shadowing the creases of her knuckles. A maid she did not know directed her toward the smaller withdrawing room where account books were kept before announcements. The room had no fire lit. It smelled of sealing wax, damp wool, and old paper. Helena knelt by the crate and began to sort ledgers by district and subscription class, aligning edges against the table in straight, exact lines because disarray invited accusation. Her hands trembled, first from cold, then from hunger, then from the effort of forcing both aside. She rubbed at a stain with the corner of her sleeve and felt the fabric catch where it had thinned to near gauze. Her cuffs were clean. Her collar was not frayed. These were victories measured against ruin. Through the wall she could hear the first rise of conversation from the ballroom as musicians tuned strings and chairs scraped marble. Names passed through the door in fragments. titles, trades, donations promised before they were counted. She lifted each ledger, checked each clasp, and entered corrections in a narrow merchant's hand no one in that house admitted she possessed. By the second week of March, she had become as necessary and as disregarded as the brass weights on Lady Rathbourne's writing desk. When figures failed, Helena was summoned. When figures held, Helena vanished. She had not sat since midnight. Her calves cramped when she stood too quickly. Her lower back throbbed where the crate had pressed bone. She pressed 2 fingers against her abdomen until the muscle released, and then resumed work. A drop of rain slid from her hairline into the ledger margin. She blotted it at once and dried the page with her palm. Near the top of the first donor sheet she saw 3 sums altered in a hand that was not hers, each rounded upward in public and downward in the private copy. She stared at the numbers until they steadied and copied both versions onto a scrap she hid inside her cuff. It was not defiance yet. It was memory, in case memory was demanded. The doors to the corridor opened and shut in a constant rhythm. Laughter surged and receded. Somewhere nearby a child cried once and was hushed. Helena finished stacking the final volume and tied the bundle with twine, each knot clean, each tail cut short. She rose, swayed, then braced her palm against the table until the room stopped tilting. Her stomach clenched hard enough to make her teeth press together. She swallowed, lifted the ledgers Lady Rathbourne would claim as her own preparation, and moved toward the ballroom entrance where light spilled in broad gold bands across the floor. At the threshold she paused just long enough to smooth her face into composure, because suffering had to be invisible if one wished to survive it, and stepped inside without warmth, without breakfast, without witness, and without lowering her eyes. The ballroom heat struck her face first, then the noise, then the light. Chandeliers burned above polished plaster and gilt. Wax and perfume lay heavy over damp wool, and wet leather brought in from the rain. Lady Rathbourne stood near the long subscription table in deep plum silk, one daughter to either side, all 3 arranged as if painted there by rank itself. Helena crossed to them with the ledgers against her hip, and stopped where habit had taught her to stop, 1 step behind and half turned so she could be summoned with a glance and dismissed with the same economy. Lady Rathbourne did not thank her for the books. She slid a fan along the edge of the top volume, checking for moisture as if testing produce at market. "You are late enough to be remarked upon," she said without looking up. "Wipe your boots. If anyone asks, you came with the clerks." Miss Amelia Rathbourne, fair and satin-skinned, let her gaze travel from Helena's cuffs to her hem, and smiled at a nearby matron as if sharing a private amusement. "She always looks as if she has run through a storm drain," she murmured. Miss Clara, younger and sharper in the mouth, lifted the ribbon at her own wrist, a grey-blue silk Helena recognised from a gown her mother had worn on summer evenings before illness hollowed her cheeks. "Do keep your sleeves down, Helena. Ink stains are ungentlemanly." 2 men at the edge of the table looked over, looked away, then looked back when they saw Helena's face in full light. Not desire, appraisal, classification. "Useful, not presentable," Lady Rathbourne had said, and the room accepted the distinction because rooms like this always did. Helena set the ledgers in a neat row by district and number, keeping her shoulders level while hunger sent a small, hard tremor through her abdomen. She tasted metal at the back of her throat. Across the floor, white-gloved servers moved with trays of sugared almonds and spiced wine. No tray came near her corner. Lady Rathbourne snapped her fan shut once. "When the Prussian gentlemen arrive, you will stand at my left. You will speak clearly. You will not improvise. If you shame me, you may find your trunk outside by 11. Helena inclined her head. Yes, Lady Rathbone. Her voice stayed even. That was one thing still hers. A quartet struck the first formal measure, and the sound cut through her like a memory of discipline. Her father had counted in that same steady pattern when he taught her columns at the walnut desk in the old morning room, tapping once for debit, once for credit, once for what must be proved if either side refused to balance. He had never raised his hand to her. He had never laughed when she erred. He had only set the ruler beside the page and said, "Try again, little hawk, there is no shame in correction." The shame came later, after fever took him in 6 days and left the house full of men who spoke softly while carrying away certainty. Helena saw those days in flashes that still arrived without invitation. The doctor's boots by the bed curtains, her father's signet ring too loose on his cooling hand, the way her mother's fingers shook so hard she could not tie her own mourning bonnet. Debts appeared after the burial, pages and pages of them in unfamiliar hands, tied with legal ribbon and witnessed by men who never met her eyes, warehousing losses, insurance shortfalls, interest compounded on obligations he had cleared years before. Helena had stood in the counting room with the old head clerk and watched him turn pale at the figures. He had whispered, "These are not his numbers," and resigned before dusk. In the years since her father's death, that whisper had become the spine of Helena's waking life. Not his numbers, not his debts. Yet the claims stood. Creditors came. Assets were liquidated for stability. Silver gone first, then paintings, then books. When her mother died in the winter coughing season, Lady Rathbone assumed management with a prayerful expression and an iron inventory book. Sentiment was expensive, she said. Efficiency was mercy. Helena learned what mercy meant in that vocabulary. 1 meal reduced to teach gratitude, 2 to correct tone, household keys reassigned, staff instructed that Miss Webber had no authority in any room but the attic and the work table. On paper, she remained a relation. In practice, she became unpaid labour with excellent German. Lady Rathbone touched Helena's elbow now with 2 gloved fingers, a public gesture that looked almost kind. The pressure said otherwise. "Do not drift," she said. "You stare when you should listen." Helena lowered her gaze to the pledge sheets and began checking lines already checked, because movement prevented comment. Around them, guests arrived in layers of privilege that made their own weather, damp capes shed, jewels revealed, names announced by footmen with perfect lungs. Amelia accepted compliments as if they were owed by natural law. Clara complained that the rooms smelled of wet dogs because tradesmen had been admitted early. "Mamma, must we stand near the door?" she asked. "I cannot endure draughts, and Helena is attracting looks." Lady Rathbone's answer came in a smile so controlled it barely moved her mouth. "Then stand straighter, darling. If people look at her, they will compare." She turned to Helena. "Fetch my vinaigrette from the green reticule. Not the blue. The blue is for family calls." Helena knew where both reticules hung, in the retiring room. She knew because Lady Rathbone made her pack them and unpack them, cataloguing ribbons and combs as if she were quartermaster to a small, elegant army. She returned with the green and held it out. Clara took it first, opened it, and selected the silver scent bottle with deliberate slowness. "Do you remember this chain?" she asked Amelia, lifting the fine gold links at her throat. "It was in that dreadful escritoire in the nursery corridor." Amelia laughed behind her fan. "Half the house was in that dreadful escritoire." Their voices were light. Their eyes stayed on Helena. The chain had been her mother's wedding gift, packed in linen with a note in her father's hand. "Keep this for winter balls when she is old enough. Helena had found the box empty the week after Lady Rathborne took the keys. She did not reach for her throat now. She did not move at all. To move would give them harvest. Lady Rathborne accepted the vinaigrette and snapped it shut. "If you are finished dreaming," she said softly, "you may sort the widow subscriptions and remove any duplicates. Your penmanship is useful even when your face is not." Helena bowed once and stepped back to the side table, where lists were spread in 2 stacks, one for public display, one for internal accounting. Her eyes burned from fatigue. She blinked until the letters steadied. At the far end of the room, 2 merchant widows in plain black wool stood uncertainly with donation envelopes in hand, waiting for someone with rank to acknowledge them. No one did. She crossed to them before she could count the cost. "Madam, may I assist you?" The older widow looked relieved enough to sway. "They said this was for sailors' families," she said, pressing the envelope down as if afraid it might be refused. "My son was lost off Yarmouth. I had thought—" Her voice frayed. Helena took the envelope with both hands, not as a servant taking instructions, but as one person accepting trust from another, and read the enclosed note quickly in case spelling errors might invite ridicule if passed directly to Lady Rathborne. The figures were careful and painfully small. 2 shillings and 6pence, enough to mean coal surrendered for a week. "Your contribution is entered," Helena said. "It will be counted in full." The younger widow exhaled. "You are kind, miss." Helena almost answered that kindness had nothing to do with it. Arithmetic did. People lived inside figures. Her father's words stood in her throat like a held breath. She carried the envelopes back to the table and entered both sums in the primary ledger before placing them into the box reserved for family relief. She then checked the parallel sheet Lady Rathborne had prepared and saw, under district totals, a neat adjustment in lighter ink reducing widow contributions by 1/3 and raising private patron offsets accordingly. Display generosity, conceal extraction. The method was elegant in its ugliness. Her fingers tightened around the pen until the nib scratched. "Do not blot," Lady Rathborne said behind her, appearing at her shoulder with rose water and silk and the certainty of ownership. "And do not peer at columns that are beyond your remit." Helena kept writing. "If the columns are read aloud tonight, they must align." Lady Rathborne leaned closer, voice smiling for anyone who might overhear. "They must serve. Alignment is secondary." Amelia drifted near, eyes bright with the anticipation of sport. "Helena grows moral when hungry," she said. "It is almost endearing." Clara's fan fluttered once. Perhaps virtue is cheaper than breakfast. A gentleman 3 feet away heard that and pretended he had not. That was the worst of such rooms, not cruelty. Consent by silence. Helena sanded the wet ink and shook off the excess grains. "Would you like me to remove the widow lines entirely, Lady Rathborne?" she asked in the same mild tone she used for dates and addresses. "It would save alteration later." Lady Rathborne's pupils narrowed by a fraction. She understood the blade hidden in the courtesy. "No," she said. "Leave them visible. We are not monsters." She straightened and raised her voice for the table around them. "Miss Webber is invaluable with tedious details. We should all be grateful for diligence in those less fortunate than ourselves." Several heads nodded. Helena wrote the next line without letting her hand shake. A bell chimed in the entry corridor, 3 measured strokes that signalled the arrival of foreign subscribers, and the room shifted toward performance. Chairs adjusted, smiles arranged. Men with influence moved closer to the table while pretending indifference. Lady Rathborne lifted her chin and extended one finger toward the place beside her left shoulder. "Now," she said, "stand where I can hear you breathe. If anyone addresses you directly, you answer through me." Helena moved into position, the ledger open in her hands, and felt the old weight settle across her ribs. Father dead, mother gone, house partitioned, name borrowed, labour unacknowledged, truth converted to convenience by those who could afford witnesses. None of it belonged to the past. It moved with her from room to room and sat in every calculation she was ordered to polish. At the doorway, the first Prussian delegate removed rain-damp gloves and bowed. Lady Rathbone turned her smile to brilliance. "Miss Weber," she said without moving her lips, "earn your keep." Helena lifted her head, met the delegate's searching eyes, and began to translate. Helena lifted her head, met the delegate's searching eyes, and began to translate. His German was formal and northern, clipped at the ends. Lady Rathbone's English answer was warm at the surface and hollow underneath. Helena carried each sentence across the gap without adding or softening. Quantities, ports, insurance against winter spoilage, widow allotments promised for men lost at sea. The words moved cleanly through her mouth while her fingers held the ledger steady at the margin where the altered figures sat like a hidden rot under polished floorboards. A second delegate stepped in, then a third, damp cuffs darkening polished wood as they leaned over the subscription sheet. Chairs scraped near the card tables. A magistrate laughed at something she could not hear. Lady Rathbone's fan opened and closed in measured beats, her signal for pace, emphasis, obedience. Helena obeyed the first two and ignored the last in the only way she could, by rendering every number exactly as spoken and recording every sum exactly as given. Then a footman in another household's livery appeared at Lady Rathbone's elbow with a sealed note on a tray, his face carefully blank, and the fan stilled mid-air. Lady Rathbone took the note, glanced at the crest, and the colour at her mouth thinned by a shade before she smiled again for the men in front of her. "Continue," she said through her teeth. "Do not stop." She broke the seal with her thumb, read 3 lines, folded the paper once, and pressed it into Helena's palm beneath the table edge, where no guest could see. The wax was still tacky. "Read it in the withdrawing room," she murmured, eyes fixed on the Prussian delegates as if discussing tea. "Now, return in 3 minutes. If this subscription fails by 1 farthing, your trunk goes to the pavement before midnight and the attic lock is changed while you watch." Her smile widened. "Move!" Helena moved. She set the open ledger down, with care she no longer felt, crossed behind 2 chairs and slipped through the side door into the corridor where the heat fell away and damp stone breath met her face. Her knees felt hollow. The letter edge cut her thumb through the torn glove as she broke the fold. Not from a friend, not from a creditor. A short note in Lady Rathbone's own hand, written quickly and without flourish, as if speed made cruelty efficient. "If Norbridge does not sign for the full amount, you are removed tonight. No wages owed. No reference given. Your father's remaining papers will be burned." The corridor lamps hissed in their glass chimneys. A servant passed carrying fresh candles and did not look at her. Helena read the line about her father twice and felt a hard, bright pressure rise under her ribs that was not fear and not yet anger, something colder and cleaner than either. Her safe ground had always been numbers, and now even that narrow plank was kicked from under her. She folded the note into a square so small it could fit beneath a seal and slid it into her cuff beside the copied sums from earlier. She would not leave that handwriting where it could disappear. She turned back toward the ballroom doors, and a sharp crash broke from the adjoining passage, glass on stone, followed by a woman's cry and the heavy thud of a body striking the wall. Helena ran before she chose to. An elderly widow in black wool had fallen against a pedestal where a punch bowl had stood. She now half sat, half sagged on the marble, one hand braced uselessly, breath soaring in frightened bursts, while two gentlemen recoiled from spilled liquid soaking their shoes. "Do not move her arm," Helena said, kneeling into glass and wet without counting the ruin to her hem. "Mrs. Finch, look at me. Slowly. Breathe with me." She did not know the widow's name, and gave her one from the donation list to tether her to something ordinary. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." She eased the older woman upright against the wall, checked her temple for swelling, then looked up at the nearest footman. "Water, clean cloth. Send for the house surgeon if one is present." The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder for a rank that outranked hers. Helena's voice cut through the corridor. "Now!" He went. The widow's fingers clutched Helena's sleeve, shaking. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I did not wish to be trouble." Helena swallowed the answer that rose first. "You are not the trouble." "You are unhurt," she said instead. "You slipped, that is all." Movement crowded the corridor mouth. Silk rustled. Lady Rathbourne's scent arrived before her voice. What has she done now? Lady Rathbourne stood framed by doorlight, one hand gripping Clara's wrist, Amelia at her shoulder with a handkerchief pressed to her nose as if the scene itself had a smell. Guests gathered in a loose crescent, curious and careful, each keeping enough distance to deny involvement. Lady Rathbourne did not look at the widow first. She looked at Helena kneeling on wet marble in torn gloves and said, "If you cannot carry a tray without spectacle, you may leave this house tonight." Helena rose slowly, glass grit clinging to her skirt. "She fell on spilled punch," she said. "The stand was unsteady." Lady Rathbourne's eyes flicked to the shattered bowl and back, calculation quick as a blade. "You were absent from the table when subscribers arrived. If Lord Norbridge departs unsteined, you will not return with us. Do you understand me?" The widow tried to speak. Lady Rathbourne cut across her with bright concern for the audience. "Mrs. Finch, how distressing! Amelia, fetch lavender salts. Clara, do not stand in the draught." Then, lower to Helena alone, each word distinct. 3 minutes have passed. Helena should have gone at once. She stayed one breath longer, long enough to place the recovered envelope from the widow's pocket back into her hand and close the fingers over it. The older woman's eyes filled. "Thank you," she whispered. Lady Rathbourne saw the gesture and smiled without warmth. "Compassion becomes you, Miss Webber," she said. "Pity it does not pay household expenses." She stepped aside, granting passage like a queen granting pardon. "To the card tables. You will translate for Norbridge directly. You will make him pleasant. If he mocks you, smile. If he leaves, do not come back." She tapped Helena's cuff, where the note hid. "I do not repeat myself." By 9:30, the ballroom had shifted from polite arrival to hard negotiation. Clusters of men formed and broke around the card tables, where pledges were treated like wagers and reputations like collateral. Helena crossed the room with her pulse too fast and her sleeves damp at the wrists from spilled punch and widow tears. She saw him before anyone spoke his name. The Earl of Norbridge stood with 2 magistrates and 3 shipowners near the far table under a chandelier that threw white fire into his dark hair. He was taller than the men beside him by a clear head. His shoulders filled his coat, as if cloth had been drafted around a soldier first and an aristocrat second. No ornament, no unnecessary movement. A scar ran pale from the edge of his jaw into the shadow beneath his ear, and vanished under his cravat. His face looked carved, not handsome in the soft manner the ballroom praised, but severe enough to quiet a room when he chose. He held a card between two fingers and listened to a ship owner's appeal without nodding, his eyes fixed on the ledger, not the speaker. Everyone knew him, Helena thought, with the detached certainty one reserved for weather and taxes. Everyone knew his title, his estates, his refusal to indulge fools. She also knew with the same certainty that one signature from that hand stood between her and the street. Lady Rathbourne joined the group in a sweep of plum silk and bright civility. "My Lord Norbridge, what fortune that you honour us!" The Earl inclined his head a fraction. "Lady Rathbourne," his voice was low and unadorned, no warmth offered, no insult yet. "You promised revised figures from Hamburg and Bremen." Lady Rathbourne laughed lightly. "And I have brought the best linguist in my household to satisfy your exacting standards, Miss Weber." She did not present Helena as kin. She presented an instrument. Helena stepped into the ring of candlelight, ledger open, every pair of eyes turning to classify, compare, enjoy. Her wet hem chilled her ankles. Her stomach knotted so hard she felt briefly light. She set her finger on the first line and addressed the Prussian shipping representative at Norbridge's right. "Herr Dr. Albrecht, if you please, I will render your terms for the table." The man began in German, dense with legal phrasing and freight percentages. Helena translated cleanly, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, and gave the corresponding English figures without pause. Norbridge looked up at the first sentence, not because she faltered, but because she did not. His gaze landed on her face, then on her cuffs, then on the split seam at her glove, where the skin beneath had reddened raw. It returned to her mouth as she spoke, measuring cadence with a precision that felt almost physical. She finished the clause. Silence held one beat too long. Norbridge gave a short, incredulous laugh, angled toward the magistrate at his left. "Your English stumbles, Miss Weber." The men around him shifted, anticipating colour in her cheeks, lowered eyes, acquiescence. Amelia, hovering 3 yards away, leaned toward Clara with visible delight. Helena did not flush. The heat had gone out of her body in the corridor and had not returned. She met the Earl's gaze directly and answered in the same level tone she used for totals and dates. "My lord, accuracy does not require your accent." The magistrate coughed into his fist. One shipowner looked abruptly at the cards as if they had become fascinating objects. Clara's fan stopped mid-flutter. Lady Rathbourne's smile froze, then sharpened. Norbridge's expression did not change, yet something in his stillness altered, a minute recalibration, as if a weight he expected to be light had proved iron. He set the card down. "Continue," he said. She continued. Albrecht dictated a corrected freight schedule. Helena rendered it with exactness, including a clause Lady Rathbourne had hoped to omit concerning direct disbursement to sailors' dependents. Lady Rathbourne cut in at once. "That final condition is ceremonial. We may summarise." Helena kept her eyes on the page. "The clause binds disbursement timing, Lady Rathbourne." Norbridge's gaze moved from Helena to Lady Rathbourne. "Read the clause in German," he said. It was a command, flat and absolute. Helena read. The room heard the foreign consonants and understood none of them, but they heard certainty. Norbridge held out his hand without looking away. "The English line." She placed the ledger in his grasp. He read, jaw tightening once. "This is not ceremonial." Lady Rathbourne's laugh returned too quickly. "My lord, these drafts are always untidy before final copy." Norbridge lifted his eyes. "Untidy is one word." He returned the ledger to Helena, not to Lady Rathbourne. A shipowner attempted rescue with jovial impatience. "Come, Norbridge, we are here to fund widows, not quarrel over syntax." Norbridge did not turn. "Syntax determines whether widows eat." He faced Helena again. "The Bremen totals. Speak them yourself," Lady Rathbone interposed with a rustle of silk. "If you prefer, my lord, I can provide a polished summary." He cut across her without raising his voice. "I did not ask you." The words landed like a struck bell. Helena read the totals. Her voice held. Her hands did not. By the fourth line the tremor had become visible even across the table, fine and relentless, hunger and cold and strain written in muscle. Norbridge noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed the way she braced her hip against the table edge to stay steady. He noticed the faint yellowing above her left cuff when the fabric slipped back half an inch. He noticed the drop of water that slid from her damp hem and darkened the parquet between polished boots. "Stop," he said. Helena looked up, breath catching at the suddenness. Lady Rathbone spoke at once, alarm hidden under laughter. "My lord, she is entirely capable. She is merely dramatic when observed." Norbridge's eyes stayed on Helena. "You are shaking." A statement, not a question. She could have lied. She had lied for survival in smaller matters, not this. "I have been on my feet since midnight, my lord." Lady Rathbone hissed her name under her breath. Norbridge did not glance at her. "Food?" he asked Helena. One word, the nearest thing to mercy spoken in command. Helena felt the room lean inward. She heard her own pulse in her ears and chose precision because it was the last dignity no one had managed to strip. "Half a heel of bread at midnight, my lord." A beat passed. Norbridge's jaw shifted once. He turned to a footman at the wall. "Bring broth, bread, now to this table." The footman looked at Lady Rathbone by reflex. Norbridge's voice dropped colder. "You heard me." The man moved. Lady Rathbone's fan snapped open so hard the sticks clicked. "My lord, you are kind beyond necessity, but Miss Webber is accustomed to household discipline." Norbridge's gaze slid to her at last. Winterflat. "Discipline that leaves a translator fainting over subscription law wastes my time and your donor's money." He faced Helena again. "Finish the Bremen totals. Then you will sit while you eat." It was phrased as order, impossible to mistake. Helena lowered her eyes to the ledger because if she held his gaze another second, the room might see too much. The humiliation of being catalogued in public, the relief of being seen at all, the dangerous, involuntary warmth that moved through her chest at a command that sounded like protection. She read the next line and her voice did not break. "Bremen tonnage, winter losses, bonded warehousing fees." The words moved through her mouth with the same precision her father had demanded at the walnut desk, each number set down in place like stone in a wall no one else had patience to build. When she finished, Norbridge took the page from her hand and scanned it once, quickly, then laid it flat beside the cards, as if it were evidence, not paper. The footman returned with a tray that steamed in the candlelight. A porcelain bowl. A heel of fresh bread split clean. Not charity wine and sugared peel for display, but broth, plain and hot. Norbridge did not touch it. He nodded once toward the chair nearest the table. "Sit!" Helena felt every eye turn again. Lady Rathbone's fan clicked open and shut with brittle rhythm. Amelia looked offended on behalf of the room. Clara looked delighted by the spectacle. A clerk at the edge of the crowd stared at the floorboards, unwilling to witness and unwilling to leave. Helena set down her pen and lowered herself into the chair because her knees had begun to pulse with weakness she could no longer disguise. The broth smell rose, salted and rich, and her stomach cramped so sharply she had to press her fingertips under the table edge until the pain eased. "Eat," Norbridge said. She lifted the spoon. Her hand trembled once, then steadied. The first mouthful burned her tongue. She swallowed anyway. Warmth hit her empty stomach like a blow, and then spread, painful and necessary. Lady Rathborne leaned toward the magistrate with a small laugh, loud enough to travel. "My household appears to have acquired a patron," Norbridge answered without looking at her. "Your household appears to misunderstand arithmetic and labour." The magistrate coughed into his hand again, as if smoke had caught his throat. No one laughed. Helena took a second spoonful and forced herself to breathe between each swallow. Across from her, the Prussian delegate waited with patient dignity, while English gentlemen pretended not to measure how quickly she ate. She stopped at half the bowl, set the spoon down and pushed the bread toward the widow in black wool, who stood nearest the table with both hands clenched around her reticule. The woman had returned to the ballroom after her fall, face drained and lips colourless, too proud to ask for a seat. "Please," Helena said quietly, "you have had a harder evening than I." The widow hesitated. "Miss, I could not—" "You could," Helena said. "Take it while it's warm." The woman accepted the bread with shaking fingers and held Helena's gaze for one grateful beat before she turned away, shoulders no longer folded inward with quite the same defeat. Helena did not look toward Norbridge. She did not need to. She felt the weight of his attention settle, still and exact, on the hand that had offered food she needed herself. Lady Rathborne's smile did not shift, but colour rose high at her cheekbones. "Miss Webber is theatrical in small acts," she said, to no one in particular. "One must forgive people who mistake gestures for substance." Norbridge's reply came flat. "Substance is what remains when gestures fail." He returned to the ledger. "District East totals." Helena resumed her place beside the table and read. The crowd loosened by inches, disappointed that scandal had become work again. Pens scratched, coins changed hands. Pledges were entered, amended, witnessed. Every third line carried a discrepancy she recognised from Lady Rathborne's private sheet, small enough to evade a hurried eye, large enough to empty a widow's quarter. She corrected what she could in open ink, naming each donor sum clearly in both languages, so no one could later claim confusion. At the end of each declaration, Norbridge repeated the number aloud in English and had the clerk beside him write it in a separate column. Verification as discipline, discipline as protection. By 10 o'clock, the chandeliers had begun to smoke at the wicks, and the rooms smelled of wax, damp silk, and men who had stood too long in heavy coats. Helena's back throbbed. Her fingers were cramped around the pen. She welcomed the pain. Pain meant she was still upright, still counting, still one line ahead of erasure. A commotion rose near the musicians' platform, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through table talk. A boy of perhaps 8 had slipped past a footman and collided with a side stand where crystal glasses had been set for wine service. The stand tipped. 2 glasses shattered on the marble. Guests stepped back with small cries of annoyance as shards skated across the floor. The child froze in the centre of it, eyes wide, lower lip trembling but unfallen. A thin line opened across his palm, where he had tried to catch himself. "Edmund!" someone hissed from the crowd. "Stand still!" No one moved toward him. Silk feared broken glass. Rank feared awkwardness. The boy stood amid glittering fragments with blood brightening his skin in a narrow, startling thread. Helena set down the ledger and crossed the floor before she asked permission. She lifted her skirt just enough to step between the shards and crouched in front of him, keeping her voice low and even. "Do not look at your hand," she said. "Look at me." His breath hitched. "It hurts." "I know. Give me your other hand first." He obeyed, fingers cold and damp in hers. She scanned the floor, chose a clean path, and shifted him backward by inches until both stood clear of the glass. Only then did she take his injured hand and turn it gently under the light. The cut was shallow but long, more shock than danger. He was shaking hard enough that his teeth clicked. "Breathe slowly," she said. "You are safe." She looked up. "Clean cloth. Water, now." A maid in house livery moved at once. 2 gentlemen did not. Helena did not look at them twice. She untied the narrow strip of linen hidden inside her cuff, where she kept spare binding thread and, finding it too small, tore a length from the inner edge of her own sleeve with one sharp pull. The fabric gave with a soft rip that carried farther than it should have in the hush. The boy stared. "You ruined your dress." "It was already ruined," Helena said. "Hold still." She wrapped the cloth around his palm, firm enough to stop the bleed, gentle enough not to frighten him further. He watched her face, as if reading weather there. Behind her she heard Lady Rathbourne's breath draw in at the sight of torn fabric and public disorder. "Miss Webber," Lady Rathbourne said, each syllable lacquered. "Leave him. The servants will tend to family." Helena did not rise. "He is tended." A shadow fell across the marble. Norbridge had crossed from the table without haste, and the room had opened for him without being asked. He looked first at the boy, then at the binding, then at Helena's torn sleeve and reddened hands. His jaw tightened once. "Edmund," he said. The child looked up at him at once. "Show me." The boy lifted his hand obediently. Norbridge did not touch the bandage. He looked at Helena instead. "Will it require a surgeon?" "Not unless he develops fever," she said. "The cut is clean. He must keep pressure for half an hour." Norbridge gave one curt nod. "You heard her," he told the maid with the water basin. "Pressure! Fresh cloth in 30 minutes." The maid bobbed and moved. Edmund leaned toward Helena despite the Earl's presence, and whispered, not quietly enough, "Do not go." The plea struck her harder than it should have. Children did not ask her to stay. They were usually taught not to speak to her at all. "I am here," she said. Norbridge's gaze stayed on her face for a breath that felt longer than the room allowed. Then he looked down at his nephew and spoke in that same command voice, made unexpectedly careful. "Miss Webber returns to work. You will sit by the fire and do as told." Edmund frowned, lower lip trembling again, then nodded because this was clearly not a man one defied in public. Norbridge turned to Helena. "Thank you." The words were quiet. No flourish. No audience in them, though the audience heard. She rose, knees stiff, and stepped back toward the subscription table. A murmur followed like draught along stone. Not pity now, not mockery either. Something less comfortable for the room, recalculation. Lady Rathbourne met her at the edge of the crowd with a hand clamped hard around her forearm, just above the cuff, where bruises had not yet faded. "You will come with me," she said through her smile. Helena tried to pull free without scene. The grip tightened. "The final pledge sheet requires your hand immediately, and you have already made enough display for one evening." Norbridge's voice came from behind them before Helena answered. "Miss Webber is needed here." Lady Rathbourne turned, still smiling. "Only for a moment, my lord. A housekeeping error. I should not burden you with domestic confusion." Norbridge's eyes flicked to Lady Rathbourne's fingers digging into Helena's arm. The Earl's expression did not alter. "One moment," Lady Rathbourne inclined her head. "Precisely." She released Helena only when they reached the side corridor and the ballroom doors closed behind them with a heavy click. The smile dropped from her mouth as if wiped away. "You have become very bold on borrowed bread," she said. The withdrawing room was colder now than before. Someone had opened the transom, and rain breath moved under the door. Lady Rathbourne shut it hard, crossed to the writing table, and pulled the final pledge sheet from beneath a stack of invitations. She laid it flat between them and tapped a column with one gloved nail. "You will translate these lines exactly as marked." Helena looked. Widow allocations reduced by half, administrative fees inflated, a transfer notation at the bottom rerouting the difference to a private account under a trust name she recognised from Lady Rathbourne's jeweller bills. "No," Helena said. Lady Rathbourne blinked once, as if she had misheard a foreign word. "You will pardon me. I will not read false total to the room." Lady Rathbourne leaned in, voice soft as silk drawn over a knife. "You will read what keeps this household standing. You will read what keeps your name from debtor notices and your body from the street. These funds are pledged to sailors' families." "These funds are pledged to my management," Lady Rathbourne snapped. "Without my management, there is no house, no table, no fire, no place for your sanctimony to sleep." Helena held the sheet steady so her shaking would not show. "You moved widow money into your private account." "Do not pretend to shock. Men move money every day and call it strategy. I do the same and am called a monster by a girl in torn sleeves." Lady Rathbourne pointed to the line again. "Read it as written, in both languages. Smile while you do it." Helena heard the blood in her ears. She thought of her father's ring loose on his hand. She thought of Mrs. Finch clutching 2 shillings as if they were breath. She thought of the boy saying, "Do not go with glass," still glittering on the floor. "I will translate the true sheet," she said. Lady Rathbourne's face stilled in a way that frightened more than shouting. "You are fed one bowl by a titled man and believe yourself untouchable. Listen to me carefully, Helena. If you refuse, I will say you altered the ledgers. I will say you stole from the box while I was assisting the child you endangered. I will say your foreign temper and your bruised vanity drove you to sabotage. They will believe me because I am believed in this city. You are not." Helena met her eyes. "Then we will see whose numbers hold." For one suspended second, neither moved. Rain ticked against the high window. Voices from the ballroom came muffled through the wall, rising toward the final announcements. Lady Rathbourne's hand flashed out and struck the side of the table so hard the inkwell jumped, not her face. The wood. "Restraint as threat. You ungrateful creature," she said, breath unsteady now. "Your father left rot and disgrace, and I spared you from the poorhouse. My father did not leave these debts." Lady Rathbourne smiled again, thin and vicious. "Dead men leave what the living can prove." The words landed like iron dropped in still water. Helena's grip tightened on the pledge sheet until the paper creased. She did not answer. She did not trust her voice to stay level if she spoke of her father in this room with this woman. Lady Rathbourne stepped back, smoothed her skirts, and resumed command as if the outburst had not occurred. "You have one final instruction. You will bring this sheet to the dais. You will read my figures. If a single line differs, your trunk will be on the pavement before the clock strikes 11, and every reference in London will close to you. Choose." Helena set the false sheet down and reached for the original ledger beneath the invitations. Lady Rathbourne moved to block her. Helena shifted left, quick with hunger and fear and the stubborn discipline of years, and took the book anyway. "I have chosen," she said. The latch clicked behind her. Helena turned. Norbridge stood in the doorway, one hand still on the brass handle, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat where he had come in from the outer corridor. He looked from Lady Rathbourne's face to the 2 sheets on the table, to Helena's torn sleeve and white-knuckled grip on the ledger. He had heard enough. His eyes said so before his mouth did. "Read the true totals, Miss Webber," he said. "I will stand beside you." The words struck the room and held it still. Lady Rathbourne recovered first. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh and spread one hand toward the table as if this were a simple clerical misunderstanding. "My lord, you arrive at an awkward instant. Miss Webber is overtired and inclined to dramatise routine revisions." Norbridge did not enter further. He remained at the threshold, broad shoulders filling the doorway, rainwater darkening his coat to near black. His gaze stayed on Helena, not on Lady Rathborne. "Bring both sheets," he said. Lady Rathborne's smile thinned. "Surely you do not mean to inspect domestic draughts in a passage-room?" "I mean exactly that." The quiet force in his voice altered the temperature more than the open transom had done. Helena felt it against her skin, a cold steadiness that did not invite argument. She gathered the original ledger in one hand and the altered pledge sheet in the other. The paper shook. She hated that he could see it. She hated more that she was relieved he did. Lady Rathborne moved between Helena and the door with a rustle of silk. "Miss Webber will return with me to the dais. You have already had her attention for longer than protocol permits." Norbridge looked at Lady Rathborne's face once, then at the hand still lifted as if to block Helena's path. "Step aside." No raised voice. No flourish. A command stripped to bone. Lady Rathborne did not step aside at once. The pause lasted only a heartbeat, yet in that breath Helena understood the scale of what had changed. Lady Rathborne had ruled by certainty. Rooms bent around her because they always had. Now she measured risk and found, for the first time in years, that her certainty had met stone. She withdrew 2 inches, then 3, and turned it into a gracious pivot for anyone who might later describe the moment. "If you insist, my lord, I am always eager for transparency." Norbridge held out his hand toward Helena. "Give them to me." She crossed the narrow space and placed both sheets in his palm. His fingers brushed hers in passing, dry and warm, despite the rain on his sleeves. He scanned the altered column first, eyes moving fast. Then he opened the original ledger and checked line against line. His jaw tightened once when he reached the transfer notation at the bottom of the false sheet. He lifted his gaze to Helena. "Did you write either alteration?" "No, my lord." "Did she order you to read them as true?" Lady Rathborne answered before Helena could speak. "I ordered no such thing. I requested a summary for efficiency, and Miss Webber, in her present state, has chosen to frame—" Norbridge cut across her without looking away from Helena. "I asked Miss Webber." The silence that followed was heavy and plain. Helena heard rain ticking against the window glass. She heard her own blood in her ears. She could still choose caution. She could still fold herself back into obedience and survive one more week, one more month, one more season in the attic. But his question had no cushion in it. It required a fact. "Yes," she said, "she ordered it in both languages." Norbridge gave one short nod, as if he had expected no other answer. "Look at me, Miss Webber." She did. "You will read the true totals. You will read every widow line in full. You will not soften a single number for anyone in that room." The command landed in her chest with the force of impact. It was not permission, it was obligation placed into her hands and held there until she could not pretend to drop it by accident. Lady Rathborne laughed softly, the sound tight at the edges. "My lord, this is absurd. You are allowing a dependent girl to accuse her own family in a public assembly on the basis of exhaustion and resentment." Norbridge folded the altered sheet once and tucked it into his inner coat pocket. Then he closed the original ledger and returned it to Helena, not to Lady Rathborne. "A dependent girl," he said, voice flat, "who has corrected your figures all evening while faint with hunger." Lady Rathborne flushed high at the throat. "You cannot know what occurs in my household." His eyes moved to Helena's cuffs, to the torn seam of her glove. to the bruise shadow just visible above the linen where Lady Rathbourne had gripped her in the corridor. "I can read evidence." He spoke the next line without heat, which made it worse. "You are starving. Your cuffs hide bruises. You are not in service by choice." Lady Rathbourne made a small sound of disbelief. Helena stood very still, because stillness was the only way to keep from breaking open under the shock of hearing her condition named aloud in that room, by that man, with no euphemism offered for comfort. Shame burned first, then anger, then, beneath both, a strange and dangerous release, as if a locked door had swung inward on its own weight. Lady Rathbourne recovered enough to lift her chin. "This is slander built from imagination. Miss Webber is clumsy, stubborn, and prone to self-neglect when she seeks attention." Norbridge did not grant her the courtesy of denial. He turned slightly toward the corridor and spoke to the footman waiting by the wall. "Fetch the magistrate at once. Mr. Hale, no one else." The footman blinked, startled by the precision. "At once, my lord." Lady Rathbourne took one quick step forward. "You are summoning a magistrate over a translation dispute?" "Over accounts," Norbridge said, "and over attempted coercion of a witness." The word witness changed the geometry of the room. Helena felt it like a key sliding into place. She had been tool, burden, relation, servant, scapegoat. Witness was different. Witness carried legal weight. Witness could not be neatly dismissed at supper and erased by morning. Lady Rathbourne saw the shift too. Her voice sharpened. "Miss Webber is no witness. She is compromised. She is personally invested in fabricating grievance. Her father's failures—" "My father's failures were forged," Helena said, before fear could close her throat. Her voice trembled once and steadied. "And these entries are theft." Lady Rathbourne turned on her with sudden brightness, the mask of civility cracking. "You ungrateful child!" Norbridge stepped between them, not quickly, not with threat. He simply moved one pace and occupied the line of sight, a wall of dark wool and quiet authority that made Lady Rathbourne stop short without being touched. "Enough!" He did not raise his hand. He did not look back at Helena. He stood there motionless while Lady Rathbourne's breathing grew audible in the small, cold room. The stillness carried more force than shouting could have held. For a long second Helena watched the back of his coat, rain drying in irregular marks, and understood that he was giving her borrowed shelter in the only language he trusted: position, command, consequence. By 11:10, voices from the ballroom had risen toward the final announcement call. The musicians were tuning again. Chairs scraped in distant rows. Norbridge spoke without turning. "Miss Webber, when we enter, you stay at my right shoulder." Lady Rathbourne gave a short laugh. "You mean to parade her?" "I mean to hear her." He turned then, and his face was hard as cut stone. "If anyone interrupts her reading, they answer to me." Helena swallowed. "My lord, if I speak, your name will be pulled into scandal." His mouth moved once, not quite a smile, not softness either. Recognition. "It already is." The footman returned with Magistrate Hale at his side, a narrow man with silvering hair and careful eyes, sharpened by habit. Hale took in the room in one sweep. Lady Rathbourne's rigid posture, Helena's torn sleeve, Norbridge's wet coat, the ledger in Helena's hands. "My lord," Norbridge inclined his head. "Mr. Hale, remain near the dais for the final totals. You will hear both language readings and witness entry verification." Hale's brows lifted by a fraction. "A formal verification at this hour?" "Yes." Lady Rathbourne spread her hands. "This is theatrical excess. The guests are waiting for supper." Hale looked at Norbridge. "Is there allegation of fraud?" Norbridge answered with the stripped clarity of a military report. There is discrepancy between public pledges and private transfer entries. Miss Webber identified them. I confirmed line divergence myself. Hale turned to Helena. Miss Webber, do you stand by that statement? She felt Lady Rathbourne's stare like pressure at her temple. She heard her own pulse. She remembered Mrs. Finch's envelope, Edmund's shaking hand, her father's voice counting columns in the morning room. Yes, she said, I stand by it. Hale nodded once. Then we proceed carefully. Lady Rathbourne's composure flickered. Proceed where? Into public slander on the word of a hungry girl. Norbridge's reply came cold and final. Proceed into light. He opened the door to the corridor and stepped aside for Helena to pass first. She did not move immediately. The ledger edges cut into her damp palms. Her legs felt unsteady again, though she had eaten, though heat from the ballroom rolled toward them in a gold wave. Norbridge noticed. He noticed everything. Stop bracing your knees, he said quietly, too low for the others to hear. You lock when you are about to fall. She stared at him, startled by the intimacy of the observation. I am not about to fall. No, he said, because you will lean once if unneeded, then continue. The words were almost brusque. They should have embarrassed her. Instead, they steadied something inside her that had been shaking since dawn. Lady Rathbourne made an impatient sound behind them. Must we linger in passages while guests grow restless? Norbridge did not look away from Helena. One more thing. His voice dropped, still formal, still controlled, and yet the line could not be recalled once spoken. I watched you give away your bread. Helena's throat tightened. She did not know what answer that line required. He continued before she could find one. I watched you bind my nephew with your own sleeve while his family stood back. I watched you return a widow's envelope when no one was looking. I have watched you keep this evening from collapsing while others fed on your labour. Each sentence landed with deliberate weight. Not praise, not courtship, record. A tally entered in plain terms, impossible to dismiss as impulse. You will not be sacrificed to protect a lie, he said, not in my presence. Heat rose under Helena's skin, despite the cold draught from the transom. It was not the ballroom warmth. It was the shock of being seen in full measure and named without ridicule. For years she had survived by becoming less visible, less audible, less herself in every room that mattered. He had just made invisibility unavailable. She found her voice, though it came rough. Why? The question hung between them, bare and unadorned. Norbridge's gaze held hers for one long beat. The scar at his jaw whitened as his teeth set. He looked, for the first time that night, like a man standing at the edge of speech he had no practice in making. Then he gave the only answer he was capable of in this moment. Because I do not permit theft from the defenceless. It was not all of it. She heard the omission as clearly as words, but it was enough to move. He extended his arm, not as ornament, not for display, but as a practical anchor through the doorway crush and marble threshold. Helena set her fingers lightly at his sleeve. His forearm went still under her hand, every muscle controlled. Together they stepped into the corridor light and toward the ballroom doors, with Magistrate Hale behind and Lady Rathbourne forced to follow at their backs. And when the doors opened and the noise of the assembly broke over them, Norbridge did not move away from her side. Norbridge's sleeves stayed under her fingers as they crossed the ballroom threshold, and the room fell quiet in waves as people understood who stood where. Lady Rathbourne reached the dais first by sheer force of habit, and lifted her chin toward the assembly with a smile that had carried her through years of theft. Magistrate Hale took position at the foot of the platform with a clerk and 2 constables in plain coats, their brass badges turned inward against panic. Edmund sat by the fire with his bandaged hand in his lap, watching Helena without blinking. Mrs. Finch stood 3 rows back, bread forgotten in her reticule, her wet eyes fixed on the ledger in Helena's grasp. Lady Rathbourne began with practised warmth. "My friends, your generosity this evening has surpassed expectation. For the relief of sailors' families, we have secured—" "Stop!" Norbridge said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He stepped beside Helena and nodded once to Hale. "Verified reading, 2 languages, line by line." A murmur moved through silk and broadcloth, then broke against his silence and died. Lady Rathbourne laughed lightly. "My lord, this is an absurd display," Hale answered, precise and dry. "It is now a legal record, Lady Rathbourne. Proceed, Miss Webber." Helena's hands shook as she opened the ledger to the marked page. She heard her own breath. She heard rain ticking against the high windows. She read the first district total in German, then in English, her accent clean and unhidden, each number set down before witnesses who could no longer pretend not to hear. At the 4th line, Lady Rathbourne interjected with a bright correction that lowered the widow allotment by £30. "No," Helena said, and read the original sum again. She continued, "Bremen, Hamburg, Yarmouth losses, direct disbursement clause, widow schedules by name and amount." By the time the long case clock at the rear struck 11, she had reached the transfer notation at the bottom of the altered sheet, the one that moved relief money to a private trust. Her throat tightened. She forced the words through. Unauthorised diversion to Rathbourne Household Reserve, entered without donor consent. The room erupted, not screams. Worse, hard voices, overlapping, outraged, counting connections and consequences. A shipowner demanded the page. A magistrate from Westminster asked for seals. Amelia burst into tears that looked rehearsed until Clara started crying in earnest beside her and clutched at their mother's sleeve. Lady Rathbourne stepped forward, eyes bright with fury and calculation. "She forged that line," she said, pointing at Helena. "She has always envied this family. She has always—" Norbridge drew the folded altered sheet from his inner coat and handed it to Hale. "Taken from Lady Rathbourne's private table in my presence." He turned to Helena. "Your cuff." Helena blinked, then understood. With numb fingers she drew out the copied scrap of early altered sums and the sealed note Lady Rathbourne had forced into her hand. She placed both in Hale's palm. The magistrate broke the seal, read, and his face changed by degrees. "If this subscription fails," he read aloud, "you are removed tonight. Your father's remaining papers will be burned." The silence after that line had weight. Lady Rathbourne moved before thought caught her. Her hand came up toward Helena's face in a swift, open strike meant to humiliate, to restore the old order in one public blow. Norbridge caught her wrist mid-air and held it there, not twisting, not shaking, only stopping her with a stillness that made even her daughters freeze. "No," he said. Hale spoke to the constables without taking his eyes off the evidence. "Lady Rathbourne, you will come with us on charges of fraud, coercion, and assault. You cannot arrest me in front of my guests." "I can," Hale said, "and I am—" As they took her arms, silk rustled like dry leaves. She looked over her shoulder at Helena. Hatred bare now. No perfume left to hide it. "You will regret this." Helena met her gaze and heard her own voice answer, low and even. "Not tonight." The constables led Lady Rathbourne through the same doors where she had watched Helena arrive drenched and shivering at dawn. Amelia tried to follow and was gently turned back. Clara sank into a chair, white as paper, and said nothing more. No one stopped the arrest. No one defended her. The loaded looks of the evening resolved into statements at Hale's table as the crowd thinned. Thomas the footman admitted he had been ordered to send Helena on foot and to carry locked document boxes from the old Webber study to Lady Rathbourne's broker. The jeweller's clerk, pale and sweating, confirmed payment from the Widow Fund Trust for private purchases. 2 donors confirmed the amounts Helena had read and the reductions they had not authorised. One matron, who had watched and smirked all season, avoided Helena's eyes and left without her wrap. Norbridge waited until the room had cleared to those required by law. Then he reached into a leather folio the size of a prayer book and drew out a folded parchment with 3 seals and a solicitor's signature. "My father's codicil," he said to Hale, then to Helena. "He held your father's emergency papers after the fever. They were never meant to pass through Rathbourne control." Helena unfolded it with hands that no longer trembled from hunger, but from shock. Her father's name, her mother's name, a trust declaration transferring the house on Cresswell Lane, its accounts and warehouse shares to Helena Webber upon her 21st birthday, shielded against any remarriage claims. Beneath it, an affidavit from the old head clerk stating the debts presented after her father's death were inconsistent with prior books and likely fabricated through duplicated bonds. She could not speak for several breaths. The chandeliers hissed above her. Wax ran down brass in slow, bright tears. At last she lifted her eyes to Hale. "Can this be enforced?" "It can," he said, "by morning injunction." 3 days later, under a thin March sun, Helena stood in the Webber morning room for the first time in 4 years while a court officer inventoried every key surrendered by Lady Rathbourne's steward. The brass key to her old bedchamber lay on the table between them. So did a list of recovered property, her mother's chain from Clara's jewel box, 2 account ledgers hidden in a linen press, and a crate of correspondence Thomas had directed officers to a hired storage cellar near the Mews. The atlas and most of her books were gone beyond recall, sold long ago, and she noted them as abandoned in the official register, with a hand that stayed steady over each title. Mrs. Davies, still in her kitchen apron, brought tea and then stopped in the doorway, as if uncertain she was permitted joy. Helena crossed the room and took both her flour-dusted hands. "You fed me when no one did," she said. "If you wish to stay, this house has need of an honest cook." Mrs. Davies wept once, wiped her eyes at once, and answered, "I should be honoured, miss." By the first week of April, Helena sat at a long table in the Assembly Annex with Hale, 2 parish clerks, and 4 widows, including Mrs. Finch, reviewing reclaimed funds and signed disbursements. No speeches, no fanfare. Coins and notes entered and witnessed. Each widow left with her stipend receipt and coal voucher. Mrs. Finch paused at the door, turned back, and pressed Helena's torn cuff strip, laundered and neatly folded, into her hand. "You saved my pride that night," she said. "I have no fine words. I have this." Helena closed her fingers around the cloth and nodded because her throat had tightened again. Norbridge came last, after the clerks had packed the boxes. He remained standing across from her, hat in hand, as formal as if petitioning at court. "Miss Webber, I request permission to call on Tuesdays and Fridays." She studied him in the late light. He was the same man who had laughed once in a crowded room and then placed himself like a wall between her and ruin. The scar at his jaw pulled faintly when he set his teeth, as it had when he chose not to look away. "On terms," she said. "Name them." "No management of my property without my signed consent. No corrections to my speech. No charity disguised as affection." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Agreed. And if you are displeased, you will speak plainly, not punish by silence." A longer pause, then. "Agreed." He inclined his head. "Then I will call Tuesday." In June, rain tapped the chapel windows while Helena stood in ivory silk that had no borrowed lace and no hidden debts stitched into the seams. Mrs. Davies fastened her mother's recovered chain at her throat. Edmund, solemn with his healed hand and a fresh cravat tied badly, carried the ring cushion and whispered as he passed, "I did not bleed this time." Helena almost laughed and did not, because the day felt too grave for anything careless. Norbridge waited at the altar, dark coat, winter eyes, hands still. The vows were brief. The register ink dried under both their names. Outside, no one mocked her accent when she thanked the rector first in English and then in German for the reading her father had loved. No one laughed at all. That evening, in the restored morning room, with ledgers stacked where they belonged, Helena signed the final disbursement order for sailors' families and sealed it with her own ring. Norbridge stood beside her and did not touch the pen. "Is there anything further?" Hale asked from the door, ready to carry the packet to filing. Helena looked over the pages once more. The note from Lady Rathbourne was archived. The altered sheet was entered as evidence. The copied scrap from her cuff was attached to the magistrate's record. The codicil was lodged with the court and mirrored in her strong-box. Every strange number had been named. Every door that mattered was now opened by her key. "No," she said, "nothing remains unresolved." Norbridge looked at her then, not as rescuer, not as master, but as witness to a balance finally brought true. "Good," he said quietly. "Stay." She set down the seal, met his storm-grey gaze without lowering her eyes, and answered in the same clear voice that had held in the ballroom. "I intend to."